the money for doing research comes largely from the pharmaceutical industry. And so the scientists who speak out will very quickly find that their grant money is turned off, and they're actually unable to enter into research programs that have any chance of contradicting the pharmaceutical company narrative or producing findings that are not suited to the pharmaceutical companies. So the entire scientific process has been corrupted in this way. And when I say the entire process, I'm not doing that by way of exaggeration. When you look around the world, it could be Canada, it could be South Africa, you will find that behind every single health department at a university, behind every single public health institution, is an amount of funding from one of these companies or one of these supranational organizations that the organization cannot afford to lose.
Warning, censorship.
So what is your role in PANDA and how you get started?
Well, my role currently in PANDA is as a chairman of the organization. How we got started was very informal. We were a group of friends who happened to have very diverse professional backgrounds. So crucially, there was the one person I was speaking to was an immunologist. So he was very helpful. And we were looking at what was happening around the world with this pandemic emerging in February and trying to understand. And as we looked at it, what we saw was a massive gap between what the media was talking about and what the facts and reality on the ground told us. And so we sat there, the immunologist, the actuary, the economist, and the lawyer, all putting our heads together to try and understand what was going on. And we were very alarmed by the hysteria, the panic. And then lockdowns came, and we got even more concerned. We were particularly worried that lockdowns would be attempted in developing countries, because unlike in Canada, the typical developing country has very little by way of social security or welfare provision. So when you try and shut down the economy, people have nothing. They have nothing to fall back upon. And so we were concerned that this lockdown mania would spread, and it did. And when our 3 weeks to save the hospitals was extended halfway through, and we began to see that there was no way out of this lockdown trap, we swung into action. We decided that something needed to be done. And we wrote a paper. We collected together a few other individuals who we had noticed were expressing similar concerns in social media. And we wrote a paper called Quantifying the Years of Life Lost to Lockdown. And the purpose of that paper was to address a major deficiency which we had seen in the whole way in which lockdowns were entered into. And that was that nobody had done any kind of cost-benefit analysis. We were in a situation where everybody was talking about the benefits in terms of flattening the curve and reducing the burden on the hospital system, but nobody was looking at the public health impacts of the economy-mediated collapse. And so we attempted to put that right by taking a look at them, looking at the economic impact of lockdown and what that would do to people's incomes and what that would do to their mortality. Because there's a very well understood connection between income and the ability to feed yourself and mortality. It's been known about for hundreds of years and priced into insurance products. So we could reverse the direction of flow of that mathematics to produce a conservative impact. And in that analysis, what we found is that lockdowns would have a public health impact in terms of years of life lost that was at least 30 times the benefit of the lockdown. And we put that paper out, put it into the media. It got a lot of reaction. Many people were of the attitude, well, how can you possibly, contradict this lockdown idea? You must be granny killers. What kind of people are you? A lot of people responded in that way. But many people saw the point And the organization started to grow, and then it formalized. And then round about October, having by then studied every single aspect of the epidemic, the models, the transmission, the testing methodologies that were being deployed, all sorts of aspects of the epidemic, and having written hundreds of articles and appeared in television and radio and on webinars and podcasts, we began to realize that nothing we were saying was being listened to. And the reason for that was that our government in South Africa was doing everything that it was doing under the air cover of the World Health Organization and other supranational organizations like the Gates Foundation and Gavi. Mm-hmm. And we realized we needed to internationalize. And as I say, that was in October. Now, PANDA is an organization represented in more than 30 countries. We have hundreds of members. Those members are involved in all aspects of science, some very closely related to the epidemic, others more peripherally related, such as engineering and ecology and so on. But what we find is having a very multidisciplinary approach to all of these difficult problems helps us to get a very rich understanding for what is going on.
And actually, what is your thought about the role of the politics in this pandemic around the world?
Yeah.
Like mostly politics is take the country and take advantage on their people. So,
yeah.
So what is your thought about that?
Well, a very serious problem in our world in general is that there is no longer any discernible separation between the institutions of science, the stakeholders in the vaccine companies, and government. They have, between the vaccine stakeholders and government, they have captured not just our institutions of science, but also institutions of media. And we are in a situation now where the science is completely perverted by conflicts of interest. Any scientist who has any kind of dissenting view cannot, as I've said, produce that view. He will just simply end his career. And the narrative is defined at a very central level. So there's a uniformity to it. And it is wrong in almost every regard. And a great fraud has been perpetrated on an unsuspecting public. So it's a very, very serious situation. And the reality, when you look at the facts and the evidence, completely departs from this false narrative.
Yeah, because you have experience with many doctors and scientists probably being disallowed to converse and debate to this topic. Maybe you know more than me, most of them probably around the world who have lived this situation to be like discredited and probably be threat to don't talk against what the government wanted the people to know about.
Correct. What we find is a lot of our members are recently retired scientists who are no longer afraid to say something because they don't work in those institutions anymore. And so 66 is a very popular age for our scientists. And it's amazing. You know, they say 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I would have had no problem saying any of this in my department or faculty. And yet, if I was still working there today, I wouldn't have a job anymore. You know, I'd be fired. The other group, we have a lot of scientists who have gone into commercial science where they own their own companies, and so they are not subject to being cancelled by a head of department, or they're not subject to having their grant funding turned off. This is one of the major problems. The money for doing research comes largely from the pharmaceutical industry. And so the scientists who speak out will very quickly find that their grant money is turned off, and they're actually unable to enter into research programs that have any chance of contradicting the pharmaceutical company narrative or producing findings that are not suited to the pharmaceutical companies. So the entire scientific process has been corrupted in this way. And when I say the entire process, I'm not doing that by way of exaggeration. When you look around the world, it could be Canada, it could be South Africa, you will find that behind every single health department at a university, behind every single public health institution, is an amount of funding from one of these companies or one of these supranational organizations that the organization cannot afford to lose.
But in the same time, I know that PANDA is not an anti-vax. However, do you have criticism of how the vaccine are being deployed amongst the public?
Yes, we do. So as you correctly point out, we are definitely not an anti-vax organization. We always strive to focus on a proportional response, something that's rooted in the evidence. And there are probably three crucial ways in which the vaccine rollout departs from the evidence, from science. The first one is that the vaccine we're moving very rapidly towards mandating of the vaccine on a universal basis. Now, one very important population should not at all be forced to take a vaccine, and that is people who have recovered from coronavirus. Yeah. So in many countries, as many as 60%, typically somewhere between 20 and 60% of the population have already had and recovered from coronavirus. And it's very, very clear from old science and new science that a prior infection gives you a very broad and durable immunity, and that breadth and depth is stronger than what you can get from a vaccine. Vaccines entail risks. The risks in these vaccines are to an extent unprecedented. If you look at the reporting, the adverse event reporting systems around the world, they are sending a signal of adverse event risks that is without precedent in the world. In America already, there are almost 10,000 entries in that reporting system, and I think that exceeds the total events reported for the previous 15 years or something like that. So we can see that there are risks. And when you are looking at a population of people like recovered people for whom there is no benefit from the vaccination, or very, very marginal benefit, if any at all, it does not make sense to expose them to those risks. Similarly, children are at incredibly low risk to coronavirus. You should call it negligible risk. There are almost no deaths among normal health children from coronavirus recorded. So to be forcing vaccinations on children and young people is again something that does not make sense from a risk-benefit perspective. The third aspect that doesn't make sense is that we are in a situation where the long-term effects of these vaccines are completely unknown. The average period that was spent in most of these studies for a person who was on the study was about 2 months. And you cannot assess fertility impacts with a study that's shorter than 9 months for obvious reasons. At least that's how I understood it when I was at university. And you cannot look at the longer term, a whole range of other longer term impacts without waiting for several years. So it seems to us that the proportional response when you're faced with that reality would be to take a minimalist approach. And it's very easy to see what that minimalist approach should be, because with coronavirus, what you have is a disease that affects the elderly in terms of its fatality rate thousands of times more than the young. So by focusing on people who are at risk of serious disease and death from coronavirus, and who have not yet recovered from the disease, which is to say something like 5 to 15 or 20% of the population, depending on the age profile of your population and the average level of health, you should be able to virtually eliminate coronavirus serious disease and death. And yet, what governments all around the world are talking about doing is vaccinating 60, 70, 80, 100% of the population. The marginal benefit of going from the 5 or 10 or 15% to those very high levels is almost zero. So for these three reasons, the inappropriateness of vaccinating children and young people, the inappropriateness of vaccinating recovered people, and the failure to take into account the fact that you can eliminate nearly all death by vaccinating a very small portion of the population, we believe that the current approach is seriously disproportionate. It is zealotry. It's a mania. This idea that you have to have a jab in every arm is simply inconsistent with the science, with the evidence.
And what do you think about us? They want to introduce a vaccine passport for going to the non-essential, for the non-essential like business, so restaurant, bar, or everything. If you're not to those vaccinated, you will not be allowed to go.
Yeah, we think this is a deeply unethical step. So there are a couple of things going wrong here. The first one is, why should anybody be interested in the vaccination status of somebody else? If you're worried about this disease, if you think of yourself as a susceptible, vulnerable individual, take the vaccine. All right?
Yeah.
If you think the vaccine works. If you think the vaccine doesn't work, then nobody should take it. Okay. But if you're vulnerable and susceptible, as far as in your own opinion or the opinion of your doctors, however you're going to reach this conclusion, then you take the vaccine. Why would you be worried about whether somebody else hasn't taken it then? You know, that's their problem. So that's for me is just an error of logic that somehow now we should all be allowed to insist on knowing what medicine somebody else has taken. This is an invasion of privacy of an unprecedented nature. The other thing is, it's long been understood in the field of medical ethics that forcing medical treatments on people is wrong. The most famous instance of this having been done was with the Nazis. And there was a whole range of processes and ethical analyses that flowed from that, from which certain oaths and principles and conventions emerged. And all of them said the same thing. You may not force medical treatments onto people. So this thing has big cross marks all over it as far as we are concerned. It's wrong. It's unethical. And it does not make sense at a very basic logical level. And it's the kind of thing that has emerged because of this hysteria, this overestimation of the disease, this idea that this thing is some kind of airborne Ebola, not a disease that when it strikes people under the age of 70 who do not have serious comorbidities, only kills 1 in 10,000.
When you look at that, and especially like I'm really curious of how's the situation in South Africa, because right now we just had like today a release of information about Africa that they say, oh my God, Delta variant have killed like in the last week 6,200 people. On 83% of that is from 5 of the countries: South Africa, Namibia, Tunisia, Uganda, Zanzibar, or whatever. It's 5 countries. But when Tanzania. I did check, the total amount of the population is 128 million of people. Yes. And we alert people on the newspaper to say 6,000 of them have dying from coronavirus. But when we look at the stat, it's 0.004%, but they just say the number of deaths, not the amount of population.
Yeah, they forget, they just leave out completely that Africa has approaching 1 billion people living in it. You know, the same is true with India. They kept on focusing on the absolute numbers, forgetting that there are 1 billion people in India. And, you know, so what does 1 billion people mean? It means that in any given year, there are around 10 million people dying, right? So 1,000 deaths is around 1/10,000th of the number of people who will die that year. And it's all part of this media-driven hysteria. And, you know, I've kind of stopped saying to people, oh, every death is tragic, et cetera, because no, you know, it is wrong that you have to start off by saying that. What has gone wrong here is that policies that are far more deadly than the virus itself have been implemented. To be locking down a country like India with 1 billion people, most of whom are poor, is to guarantee far more deaths than you're reading about in the newspapers, far more. It is an iniquitous policy. There has never been any kind of policy, not just a public health policy. There has never been any kind of policy which has driven inequality to the extent that lockdowns have.
Especially because we don't really talk about the outside effect all around the coronavirus itself. I think the death case is higher from the outside problem that coronavirus have caused, like suicide, poverty, a lot of mental disease that have been created from that, but
yes.
Nobody talk about it.
Yes, you can find yourself censored if you mention that there's been a 30% increase in drug overdose deaths or a 100% increase in suicide somewhere or something of that nature. You know, these kind of what we call Zoom epidemiologists don't want to acknowledge, don't want to see that in the real world, when people's incomes are taken away, that their health and their mental health deteriorates. And the insouciance of this, it just never ceases to amaze me. I actually cannot understand how these people do not comprehend that locking down for a couple of weeks does devastating damage, and that locking down for 1.5 years will destabilize societies, ruin cultures, absolutely destroy economies, and have an effect of devastation that is just much greater than the actual, much greater than the actual coronavirus. And it's maybe a sign of how disconnected from reality academics and people who work in these vast, sprawling multinational organizations where they don't really have any accountability. They're not even elected. Not that elected people are particularly accountable. But, you know, for people who work in the real world, who have to hustle, who have to build businesses, who have to find a way to ply a trade, you know, life is real, you know. Shut down the economy and stuff gets pretty real pretty quickly. But to these academics, they just carry on pocketing their salary that's paid for by the taxes of those people whose lives they are destroying, you know.
Yeah.
And I find it quite disturbing, astonishing. And one of the things that I haven't mentioned yet, when you look statistically at the impact that lockdowns have had in terms of coronavirus mortality, what you find is that there's no relationship between the stringency of a lockdown and the coronavirus mortality rate of a country. And what I'm not talking here about some silly pairwise comparison, taking two countries that happen to be next door to each other and saying, oh, well, this one had a lockdown and this one didn't. You can play that game all day and all night, and the one side will show you one pair that shows this, and the other side will show you another pair that shows that. That's not the way you analyze these things. You put all the countries into one database and you assess whether there's any relationship between coronavirus mortality and lockdown. And when you do that kind of analysis, the answer is always the same. Dozens upon dozens of studies have shown that there's no such relationship. Lockdowns do not result in reduced coronavirus mortality. So all of this is being done for nothing.
Yeah, I agree. And my question is like, what do you think about the situation in Canada, the country where it was nice to go and live, and now I think nobody wants to come here anymore. Oh, but they cannot come here anymore because our border is still closed.
Yeah, I mean, I love Canada. I've spent several, extremely enjoyable trips there. I have a quite large extended family there, and I contemplated it as a place to live once. So I'm I don't know the country very, very well. I haven't spent years and years there, but it has amazed me the extent to which Canada has gone from being one of the most open societies in the world, one of the most tolerant societies in the world, overnight into being one of the most intolerant, authoritarian, and closed-minded places. I have found it very, very difficult to speak to Canadians who are not on the very small our side of the table in Canada. They're militant. They have become fear. The way I interpret it is that fear has shut down their cognitive capacities. They're no longer able to think. They can't even deal with data and evidence that contradicts this narrative. It's not something their eyes glaze over. They cannot see. They don't want to see. It's been a year and a half of constant media-driven fear, constant fear from the public health organizations. And in some places where, the minutes of meetings get leaked and this kind of thing, the biggest culprit is probably Ontario province. You can see the public health officials talking with each other about how to strike fear into people. So I feel desperately sad for Canada, desperately sad. It's not the country that I knew and enjoyed. Something has gone deeply, deeply wrong, and it is behaving like 1918 Russia or 1793 France. There's a profound intolerance, an authoritarianism that is perhaps even without precedent. It's very disturbing. And what's really odd about it is I think for a lot of Canadians that, their lives are sort of, they've still got food and they've still got their screens and, there's a modicum of freedom, but their freedom of expression is gone. Freedom of association is greatly reduced. And I think a lot has been drained out of the society, and it happened in a kind of boiling frog way. 2 weeks to save the hospitals was one thing, but a year and a half of this nonsense, especially in light of the fact that the impact on Canada has actually not been very severe statistically. It's one of the least affected or less affected countries. It's very strange and very disturbing.
Especially like yesterday, I went to a conference with Prime Minister Trudeau, and I was one of the media, not mainstream media, but it got the microphone in my face just before I was going to ask my question. And when I rise up and say, you just allowed me to say my question, and you cut the microphone in my face, they asked me to leave. But they didn't, they said, the event is finished, no more question. You will need to leave because it's another event. I was like, that is wrong.
Yes.
They decide who will ask the question, and all the mainstream media is only in surface question, not deep.
Completely captured. The mainstream media is completely captured. My advice to people is to turn off the televisions and stop reading mainstream media and newspapers. Those legacy organizations are simply lying day after day after day. 90% of their content with respect to coronavirus contains material flaws, as in falsehoods, or is misrepresentative in the way that you just pointed out by focusing on absolute numbers instead of proportions and so on, giving no context, never ever explaining that this thing is not that bad, or here's some good news, or actually there's some debate in this question of whatever, cloth masks, mask mandates, lockdowns, asymptomatic transmission. There's a long list of probably 30 items where only one side of the argument is presented. And yes, all those journalists sit there like so many robots, asking the politicians exactly the questions the politicians want to be asked and swallowing the answers that those inept politicians give them. So I say to people, turn off your television, put away your newspapers, start listening and looking for the dissident voices that you will find on the fringes of social media if you scratch for just a little bit.
Yeah, I say all the time to the people, and the thing is, same in the mainstream media, they have did like survey to see like why people don't believe anymore on the mainstream media, don't really ask the question, because it's only one point of view, and you don't really want to let speak out the scientists who say, you know, Didier Raoult, I don't know, it's a scientist who really believe on hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah, he's been very outspoken.
Yeah. So he had been invited on a platform on the mainstream. The day after, it was the same if he had like apocalypse just happen. People was like, I can't believe they invite this guy on the platform. I was like, this guy have how many like awards to be like in his field of science?
Yeah, you listen to him and you try and understand why there's a disagreement between two scientists who seem to have similar backgrounds and qualifications. You know, the absence of debate and engagement has been an astonishing feature of this epidemic. I mean, this is something that has, you know, is of serious historical importance, this period. And, you know, you would think that at some point there would be panel discussions, there would be the public debates, there would be an airing of views, but you can't even begin to draw these scientists in to such a debate. And I believe it's because they know in their hearts of hearts that they are deeply conflicted and that what they are talking about is absolute drivel, nonsense of the highest order. So they can't afford to go into a debating situation. The truth is toxic for them. If they sit down with somebody who's independently minded and who's talking about the facts and the data, it is like kryptonite. They will die. Intellectually, they will die.
And I know I repeat myself, but what is actually the reality for South African people, and probably for Africa, but for South African people, because you're from there?
Well, we're experiencing in one of our provinces a fairly significant wave of infections and deaths at the moment, but we have a lockdown for the whole country, which includes some very bizarre measures. So, for example, in South Africa, the wearing of face masks outdoors is mandatory, that's ridiculous on 3 levels. First of all, coronavirus isn't transmitted outdoors. Secondly, cloth masks don't work. And thirdly, as we now can clearly see from the data, asymptomatic transmission doesn't drive the disease epidemic. So any one of those 3 reasons is a good reason not to wear cloth masks outdoors. But that carries on. They have an alcohol ban in place. We have a curfew from 9 o'clock to 4 o'clock because, you know, coronavirus only goes out at night. You know, so it's a truly ludicrous situation, and they just ignore the fact that all this intervening evidence has come forward showing that these are crazy things to be doing. Ignore the fact that none of them had any effect last time they tried them, and all of this that's been going on for more than a year and a half has had this absolutely devastating effect on the economy. Completely reversing all the gains that have been enjoyed under the post-apartheid period in South Africa, which is now a 25-year kind of process. So unemployment, which was high to start with, has gone through the roof. Inequality, which was one of the highest levels known anywhere in the world, has gone through the roof. It's gone from the highest in the world to something much worse. And we have been expecting for a long time that this would ultimately lead to significant upheaval, violent upheaval. And that time is now upon us. For the last few days, we've had an unprecedented period of property destruction and rioting. It was triggered by one of the past presidents going to jail for contempt of court. But it's, and there again, the media are fantastic. They pretend that that's the only reason. You know, they ignore the fact that the children of South Africa are about to go into their second year of no schooling. You know, think about that. Think about that. Most children in South Africa do not have the ability to go to school online. So they just, their educations have gone on hold for 2 years out of a 12-year program. You know, they ignore the fact that youth unemployment has gone from very high levels to extremely high levels, just ridiculously high levels, that the desperation and the frustration is palpable on the ground. You don't have to travel far. So South Africans are by and large people who get along. We find a way. We've had a complex history and we've all found ways to talk to each other and to reach out. And so I do what the media will not do. I travel to the townships where the poorest people in South Africa live, and I see what goes on. And what goes on is a disgrace. It's a tragedy, and it's all self-imposed. And it is inevitable that that kind of tragedy is going to lead to a massive reaction. And I think the beginning of that massive reaction is upon us. In fact, the only surprise I have is that it's taken so long to materialize.
And when do you think that all of this will end? Or maybe will probably never end, but what is your thought about it? About like maybe the end of all of that?
Provided that the democratic process stays intact, and I have some doubt as to whether it will end when politicians start acting in self-preservation, when they'd rather be embarrassed and alive than sticking to a narrative and facing political death. That point should be reached, as I say, provided that the tenets of democracy are sustained. And there are places in the world where democracy is looking seriously under threat. There's effectively been some kind of neo-communist takeover by stealth using the virus and lockdowns as the pretext. I mean, Canada's looking like that. You guys are doing things that haven't been done outside of Stalinist Russia, Maoist China, Hitler's Germany. You're doing those every day, you know?
And churches are burning down as well. I don't know if you saw it.
Yes, I've seen that. And it's interesting because the persecution of religion was also a common feature of these instances that I've looked at, you know. I often think hard about this issue. It seems to me as if one of the problems at the root of all of this might have been this very long secularization as people turned away from their traditional faiths and their traditional ways of negotiating the world. I think that process left a hole in the middle of many cultures. And what we are learning right now is that all men are ultimately religious. And when you remove the traditional gods, what comes to fill their place? Well, right now, it's been the Faucis and the Tedroses. They are the new gods, the gods in the white coat. And the religion that they preach is a religion of scientism. And that is how we find ourselves in this position, because it's not a deep religion. It's not a religion that is plugged into any ethical or value system that has caused a generative, flourishing society in the past. On the contrary, this is the kind of system that only leads to multi-decadal processes of destruction and ruin and death. So it's wrapped up to, you can go to some very deep levels as to where this kind of crazy ideology is coming from that is driving the lockdowns and this techno-securocrat medical surveillance spirit of our current time.
And what do you think PANDA would be able, what is your main goal that you want to reach with is it a movement, a foundation, all you call PANDA?
PANDA is a volunteer organization that is trying to assert open science, to reassert open science.
And what is your main goal for the future?
Reasserting open science would solve all of the other problems. So that is our main goal. But in order to do that, we need to speak to those people who are beginning to have their doubts about what has gone on, who are beginning to see through the false narrative, who think perhaps that they've been lied to by their corrupt scientists, by their inept politicians. We are trying to reach those people and to show them calmly and in a proportionate fashion what the truth looks like. And it's not that we claim to have a unique view on the truth. The things we are seeing have been conclusions that have been reached by other people independently all over the world. Smaller organizations, similar organizations to PANDA have, we meet these people after finding them in some corner of social media or noticing an article that they published in some, unconventional media outlet. And when we compare notes, it's amazing. The correspondence is always there. Same points come up, made in the same fashion by people with similar backgrounds, but having reached them completely independently, looking at the data in a different country, looking at it maybe from a different perspective. It might be doctors, it might be virologists, it might be data science people, the views are often very, very similar. And we don't even believe in a monopoly on the truth or in absolute truth. There's in science anyway, there's in science, science progresses by way of conjecture and criticism. There's a continual falsification of theories, leading to the replacement of the old theories with better ones, theories and explanations. And so we know that we're wrong in almost everything that we believe, but we also know that we can improve on our past explanations. And our organization is structured around the process of continual improvement. So we're not afraid of making a conjecture, receiving criticism, changing our minds, making a new conjecture, and in so doing, improving. And that is the very opposite of the way science has been practiced in this epidemic. Here we are told by Anthony Fauci that if you attack Anthony Fauci, you attack the science itself. It's not about the evolution of knowledge. It's by decree. Papal infallibility is what he's asking for. Okay. He doesn't need to provide a reason. He doesn't need to provide any evidence. He doesn't need to listen to people who disagree or who can show him that he's wrong. No, none of that. He is simply infallible. Yeah. I am the science, he says. Yeah. And there again, you see this religious overtone. Huh? Yeah. I am the Son. I am the Father. I am the science. We've replaced conventional religion with a very pale imitation of it.
So at Ribbon News, we want to challenge a vaccine passport. If you want to know more about it, go to our webpage, fightvaccinepassport.com. And if you can, chip in.